Okay, I'm going to go through the questions one by one for IS3167 Zone A. Before I do so, I want to make a point that hopefully is helpful to you. I'm going to read each question carefully, and I encourage you in your next examination to again read the question carefully and answer the question as it's set. So don't answer the question that was set last year, or don't answer the question that you think should have been set. Answer the question that is on the paper. That is hugely important. Okay, Zone A, question 1. Logistics hubs arising from the rubble of dead suburban shopping malls. Discuss the validity of this statement. What caused the shopping malls to die? Why are they being replaced by logistics hubs? Okay, you need to sort of decide which area the question is covering. Where is it set? Now, this particular question is a combination of B2C, business to consumer, and also supply chain management, hence the reference to logistics hubs. That's one point about it. Can I draw your attention also to the question, to the quote, which talks about dead suburban shopping malls. I'm not referring here to city centre shopping malls, which typically are much grander, more attractive, they've got a better shopping experience. Suburban shopping malls are much smaller, less exciting, less interesting. And typically the shopping experience is not great. Okay, so discuss the validity of this statement. Is it true or not, in other words? Certainly based on the data, and certainly in the UK, Europe and North America, suburban shopping malls are not doing particularly well. There's more and more individual shopping units are closing, and as they close, the whole mall becomes unattractive, so less people go into the mall anyway, the footfall drops, and yeah, they're in trouble. Recently in Scotland, one particular shopping mall, which was awful, half of it was empty. That was actually auctioned with a reserve price, in other words, a minimum price, a reserve price of £1. Okay, in the end, in the auction, it sold for more than £1, but that gives you an idea of just how much trouble certain suburban shopping malls are in. And at the same time, we're seeing the growth of logistics hubs. In other words, places where traffic can be sorted, where individual consignments can be picked, consignments for individual customers can be picked. These logistics hubs are definitely growing. So what caused the shopping malls to die? Well, this is really the growth of e-business. Clearly, more and more people are buying online, so B2C e-business is increasing, and that increase was accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic. So in answering that question, what caused the shopping malls to die? The value proposition of online B2C is pretty attractive. This is the 6 C's. So, you can argue from that point of view. The transaction costs of online B2C is less for both consumers and for retailers. It's not completely one way because, as I said before, the shopping experience in some shopping malls is much better than the sort of B2C online shopping experience. What else? Oh yeah, why are they being replaced by logistics hubs? That's what's causing the shopping malls to die. Why are they being replaced by logistics hubs? This is because with the increase in online e-business, especially when we're having deliveries to consumers' home addresses, that makes the supply chain more complicated. In days of old, supply chain was largely concerned with large trucks, articulated 40-foot trucks running between large depots. Now you don't want to, and in some cases it's physically impossible, to get one of these large trucks up a sort of suburban street to to a consumer's individual address. So basically, typically these days, with the growth of local deliveries over what's called the last mile, the goods need to be sorted again locally. So logistics operators are building these logistics hubs locally to transfer the consignments, to transfer the goods from the big trucks that come in from the suppliers or the major depots, to transfer the stuff from the big trucks into little delivery vans, ones where you can actually send them off into the suburbs and they can deliver happily. Okay, I think that's dealt with question 1. Let's go to question 2. Question 2, uncertainty is a fundamental problem for supply chain management. Why is this so? Discuss with reasons why you believe that this uncertainty has increased or diminished in recent years. Okay, this is fairly obviously a supply chain management question. And uncertainty is a basic problem for supply chain management. Why is it a fundamental problem? Quite simply, it makes planning difficult. If there was no uncertainty, if there was complete certainty, it would be wonderfully easy and straightforward to run a supply chain management system. Okay? But it makes planning difficult. It means that uncertainty means supply chains have to be flexible and maintain some spare capacity, spare resources, which in turn increases costs. To carry on the discussion, you should in this question, or in your answer, talk about the different uncertainties in supply, on the supply side, but also demand uncertainty. Supply uncertainty, this typically is due to, if you recall, Lee's matrix. Supply uncertainty is typically high supply uncertainty where you've got new products or fresh food or something like that. Low supply uncertainty when it's a stable process for production. In addition to that side of things, also on the supply side, there's things go wrong, earthquakes, pandemics, plant failures. So the supply chain disruptions happen. So that's on the supply side. On the demand side, demand uncertainty, there's typically high for fashion type goods or innovative products, where it's very hard to predict the demand, how much of a particular product is actually going to sell. Okay, discuss with the reasons why you believe this uncertainty has increased or diminished in recent years. You can argue that it's increased. Certainly, very recently with the pandemic, demand has increased. Or demand uncertainties increased, partly with panic buying, partly with consumers locked down. It's also, consumers may have been uncertain about their incomes, so whether to spend or not to spend. So I think, thinking about the pandemic, there is increased demand uncertainty. Also increased supply uncertainty if borders close or particular plants or depots have to close due to the pandemic. Other pressures, protectionism. Quite a few countries have adopted quite a sort of protectionist stance. This is true of the US. Increased tariffs. So the world is no longer flat. Consumers may worry also about sustainability and transparency of sourcing. Environmental and social performance may actually affect consumers' decision whether to buy something or not. In many countries, certainly in the West, that's UK, Europe and the US, the transport infrastructure has got rather overloaded. In many cases, the actual infrastructure is not looking good. So things like bridges, ports, airports, roads, under pressure. Okay. Even something like Brexit, with Britain leaving the European Union, that's added to the problems. So it's no longer quite so simple to move traffic between the UK and the European Union. Now, so on those grounds, I think we could argue that uncertainty has increased. You could argue that it's diminished because of the use of technology, introduction of new technologies, or technologies like EDI and RFID have certainly reduced the uncertainty in some cases. Perhaps also the improved supply chain integration through such techniques as vendor managed inventory and other strategies. Okay, let's move on to question 3. Question 3. The office is obsolete. Discuss the validity of this statement in the light of the recent surge in home working and remote working caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Give reasons for your arguments. Okay, this particular question, well, clearly it's a coronavirus type question, but it's really, I think, based in terms of theory on sort of new organisational forms. Okay, discuss, the office is obsolete. Is it obsolete? Discuss the validity of this statement. Certainly, because of lockdowns due to coronavirus, lots of people have been working from home. It's not possible for everybody to work from home. Typically, people providing personal service or people involved in transport or essential jobs like this can't work from home. But a lot of, normal sort of office workers, perhaps you and me, can easily work from home if we have to. And that's been, I think we can argue that's certainly been facilitated by the technology. So we have conferencing technology like Zoom and Teams, collaboration technology like Slack, and then laptops, smartphones, broadband, plus also social media, digital platforms, so that a lot of the communication and interaction doesn't depend on you or I being in a particular place. So we can work remotely, we can that maybe in a cafe or an airport, or it could be working at home. Does that make the office obsolete? Well, yes and no. Just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done. And in many cases where the pandemic has eased, people have gone back to working in the office for one reason or another. Now, the problems with working at home, this is problems of teleworking or home working. Basically, the sort of employee's work-life balance can be problematical. The employee may end up working too little or too much, or become stressed or alienated. It's harder for managers to manage staff at a distance. It's much easier if the manager can see the staff and see what they're doing. However, because the pandemic's been going on for so long, many employees have developed new habits, new routines based on remote working or home working, and they may not be keen to return to their old routines. So what we're seeing, I think, is a move more to hybrid working, whereby instead of going into the office 5 days a week, people go into the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and the other days they work from home. So it's that sort of flexible hybrid working, which offers certain opportunities in terms of cost saving, but it's more complicated to organise, to actually schedule people in and schedule who's going to be at home and who's going to be coming into the office. So it's hard in a way to see. I think it's going to depend a lot on sort of individual businesses. It's probably too bold a statement to say the office is obsolete. Some people like going into the office. Some people find it much easier to build relationships in the office, and teamwork becomes much easier, perhaps in the office when you're all sitting around together in the same room. Offices may still certainly be preferred for various HR functions, human resource functions like recruitment or disciplinary matters. Meetings with clients are probably more satisfactory if they're carried out in person. Strategy formulation or confidential discussions. There's quite a few things that probably are better done in offices. So it's probably too much to say the office is obsolete, but it's not too much to say that for many jobs, flexible working, a combination, a hybrid of office working and home working is probably the right way to go. Okay, hope that all makes sense.
This question asks to focus on the network economic theory, but very specifically to explain how this theory is very helpful to explain how the electronic markets have evolved, and also to discuss why the digital economy has evolved in a way where the bigger players are becoming bigger and bigger, which means where the barriers to entry are higher. So, at the beginning, the digital economy has fully exploited the potential that technology was offering in terms of reduction of transaction cost. And this has led companies to gain market shares in the digital economy. However, what has happened after the initial success of the digital economy, which has been generated by the impacts of technology on the transaction cost, a big transformation has occurred. And this big transformation is associated with the network effects that are generated by the use of businesses that rely on the value that is generated by the interaction of buyers and sellers. To explain this evolution, well, the digital economy, the network economic theory is extremely valuable. What the network economic theory explains is that very many businesses are generating value not simply by the way in which the technology is having an impact on the exchange process, as instead is explained by the transaction cost theory, but technology generates value because it allows more and more buyers and sellers to interact in an easiest way, and these interactions are generating unique values. Let's take the example of Google. Google at the beginning started its business by reducing the search cost, which means by designing technologies that made it easier to find information on on the exploding digital realm where companies were offering businesses and products. However, the more the digital economy became complex, the more difficult it became to generate value through the reduction of this transaction cost. What has happened is that Google has exploited the huge amount of searches that users were doing on its platform to make the searches better by exploiting the information that every search was sharing with Google. Which means that now the value that Google generates for the users is the result of the very high level of use of the Google search engine. So the evolution of the digital economy is deeply characterized by the exploitation of business models like the one of Google, like the one of platform ecosystems, and like the one of double-sided markets that exploit the network effects that are generated by digital platforms. These network effects are also increasing the barriers to entry because every new entrant, to make its business valuable when the business is affected by network effect, should reach the same level of use and adoption of the most established businesses. And this is very often impossible, and new search engines will not be able to provide the same value of Google up until the point in which they will have enough users as Google. And this explains why it will be very difficult for a new entrant to gain that level of adoption that is already characterizing the value generating proposition of the existing businesses. Which means that in the digital economy now, those who have large number of users or large number of buyers and sellers are actually generating very high barriers to entry, which explains why the bigger companies are becoming bigger and bigger, and it has become far more difficult for new entrants to gain market shares, which means to generate value for the consumers that are making the consumer using their business and therefore allow them to gain increasing market shares. This question is very precise in its focus. It asks to discuss how search costs are having an impact on the way in which a company is able to use dynamic pricing to generate value. So first and foremost, it is very important to understand what are search costs, and search costs are the costs that companies and buyers are facing to meet to find each other. Dynamic pricing are mechanisms by which companies are able to fix pricing that are optimizing their revenues based on the knowledge and understanding of how each individual customer is willing to engage in the exchange, which means in a nutshell how much each individual buyer is willing to pay for a specific good or service. And so by using dynamic prices, companies are able to adapt their prices so to extract as much value as possible from the market. Ideally, each individual customer will pay the maximum price that he or she is willing to pay for that specific good. So what is the relationship between search cost and dynamic pricing? Well, the more companies are able to intercept customers, which means the more are the customers that they are able to intercept, the better they are at learning how to fix prices, but also the better they will be at identifying those who are willing to pay the highest price, which means will be able to sell at the highest possible price. Let's take an example. We have 3 customers that are willing to buy a good, and each customer is willing to pay a maximum price of £3 for that specific good. If the company is able to reduce the search cost and find 100 customers, assuming that they have a limited amount of goods to be sold, like let's say 3 units, and out of the pool of 100 customers, they will identify 3 customers where one customer is willing to pay £6, one customer is willing to pay £5, and one customer is willing to pay £4, while the other 97 customers are willing to pay £3. Well, the company will sell the goods at the 3 customers that are willing to pay the highest price. So in this case, the company will sell 3 items at an overall revenue of £15. And the company had higher search cost, which means being able to find less customers. It would have only found 3 customers willing to pay £3, and its revenue would have been £9. So this is an example of the relationship between search cost and dynamic pricing. So the lower the search cost will be, the more value the company will be generating using dynamic pricing. Also, by reaching out more customers, the company will become better at understanding, will have a better knowledge of what are the customer preferences, and so even if it will not be able to use a perfect price discrimination mechanism, which means to target the price to each individual customers, but will use a segmented pricing discrimination mechanism, which is related to dynamic pricing, which means we'll use dynamic pricing for to target different groups of customers, and not each individual customer will get the same price, but group of customers with similar specificities and characteristics will get the same price, well, the more information they will get from the market, the better they will become at fixing prices that are generating more value for the company. The answer should focus on the relationship between the search cost and dynamic pricing, and explain how a reduction on the search cost is having a positive impact on the value which is generated by the dynamic pricing. And so what is happening is that by addressing this issue, the answer will also be able to explain how a reduction in the search cost for the customers, which means the customers will be able to find more more sellers, well, this reduction will allow customers also to find potentially sellers that are selling at a lower price. So the analysis of the double-side effects of the reduction of the search cost on the welfare of sellers and buyers is needed to fully address this specific question. Digital technologies has profoundly changed the way in which marketing is done. Digital technologies have different impacts on marketing. First, digital technologies are changing the managerial processes that are undertaken by the marketing function, offering new ways to collect information, to process information, and to use the available information. Think, for example, at how customers' relationship management systems have profoundly changed the ability of companies to respond to customers' needs and customers' expectations. However, this question is asking to go beyond a discussion of the major implications that digital technologies have on the way in which marketing is done. So the first part of the question, yes, requires to explain and to discuss how digital technologies are changing the managerial activities that are undertaken by the marketing function. However, the second part of the question has to focus on one specific technology, which is social media, and to discuss why social media have become so important in contemporary marketing. To answer this part of the question, it is very important to understand and to discuss what are the major functions of social media and how and why social media are potentially adding value to marketing. Now, social media are technologies that are helping producing information in a structured way. So the interactions that are taking place through social media platforms are interactions that are mediated by specific technological functionalities that are making it possible to create what are called data objects, pieces of information that can be digitized and exchanged and processed by digital technologies that become extremely useful for the marketing functions. Think, for example, at the like function of Facebook. The like function of Facebook produces extremely valuable information to people in marketing that are helping them to better identify customers' preferences, but also that are allowing to cluster customer preferences in a very innovative and revolutionary way. So the big impact and the importance of social media of contemporary marketing relies upon the way in which social media are allowing to segment, to identify preferences, and to target individual and large groups of customers. So to properly address this question, it is very important in the first part of the answer to discuss how information and communication technologies are supporting the traditional marketing function. In the second part of the answer, instead, it is very important to discuss how the specific functionalities of one technology, which is social media, is changing the way in which marketers can identify, target, and maintain relationship with their customers. By discussing these two dimensions of the impacts of digital technologies on marketing, it will be possible to fully answer the question and address what the examiners are looking forward in this specific context.
Okay, this is the examination commentary for IS3167 Zone B in 2021. Before we go through the questions individually, I think it's useful to remind you that when you do an examination, you need to read the questions carefully. Read questions, word by word, note every word in the question, and then answer that question. Answer the question that's been set, not the question that you wish had been set. Okay, Zone B, question 1. During the coronavirus pandemic, online retail, B2C business, was a lifeline for many consumers around the world. Discuss the extent to which these new users of B2C business are likely to stay online or return to conventional shopping in traditional stores. Okay, I think that doesn't require any debate or discussion that with the pandemic and the lockdowns associated with the pandemic, many people shifted to online e-business. They perhaps had no choice. It wasn't easy to get to the shops, physically, and it was a lot safer to avoid going to the shops. So certainly we did see a surge in online retail and a reduction in footfall for traditional shops. In some cases, particularly in some of the suburban shopping malls, we saw the main anchor tenants, such as department stores, close permanently, leaving a lot of vacant units. So, these new users of B2C, are they going to stay with B2C or will they return to conventional shopping in traditional stores? To discuss this, it makes sense, I think, to firstly examine the online value proposition, 6 C's, and this is, I think, an efficient way, an effective way of examining the effectiveness, the attractiveness of B2C business. However, it's fair to note that although the online value proposition is pretty strong, it's pretty convincing, on the other hand, traditional shops do offer quite a lot that B2C e-business can't offer. So often they offer a better shopping experience, it's more enjoyable, particularly suits luxury items. And we're seeing more, I think, the growth of an experience economy, whereas people actually value the experience of doing something, not just the possession of particular products. It would seem fair then to suggest that, well, some of the new users will probably stay online for at least some of their purchases, but will perhaps return to traditional shops for other purchases. In this case, perhaps retailers offering omni-channel services are likely to prosper. The notion of providing multiple alternative channels so the consumer can decide, well, I'm going to buy using e-business or I'm going to go to a conventional shop. Okay. The next question, question 2, says compare and contrast the performance of lean supply chains with that of responsive supply chains in today's business environment. Note, responsive supply chains include those sometimes known as agile supply chains. Okay, this is a straightforward supply chain management question. And the way to tackle this, I would suggest, is firstly, you need to actually define, or at least specify, the major characteristics of lean supply chains as against responsive supply chains. So, what are they? How do they differ? And if you look in the study guide, the subject guide, you'll see that a lot of it depends on the notion of uncertainty. So lean supply chains work pretty well where there's little uncertainty. And can I remind you that uncertainty is both on the supply side and on the demand side. So I think you need here to discuss both supply and demand uncertainty at least a bit. The reference here to today's business environment, I think life has got more complex over the last few years for supply chains. On the one hand, cost remains very important, and that would favour lean supply chains. But we've also seen, going back to the notion of uncertainty, that there's increased demand uncertainty due to the pandemic. So people are buying different things. Maybe in some cases people are worried about their income, so maybe they're buying less of everything. But they're certainly buying different things. The supply uncertainty, because of the pandemic, we've seen plants, factories, depots, warehouses close. In some cases, we've seen borders close. So uncertainty has increased because of the pandemic, I think. Other recent pressures, protectionism. A lot of countries have got a lot more protectionists than they were. So they've increased tariffs on certain goods. The world is not flat anymore. We've seen moves like Brexit, the UK leaving the European Union. That's meant additional complexity to UK-European Union supply chains. Consumers in many cases worry about things like sustainability and transparency of sourcing, the environmental and social performance. So they're not just interested in the product itself in many cases. They're also interested in where it comes from, how much greenhouse gas is produced in transporting the product around the world. We've also seen over the years, especially in Europe, the UK, North America, the transport infrastructure's got rather overloaded. So things like roads, bridges, ports, airports, have got more and more traffic going through, and in many cases the infrastructure has not been updated. So the transport infrastructure in many cases is overloaded. So there's a pressure on supply chains, a pressure on uncertainty. Okay, let's move to question 3. Question 3. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, many employees across the world are working from home rather than from a city centre office. Discuss how information and communications technology has facilitated this change and whether home working is likely to continue after the pandemic and the associated lockdowns have eased. Okay, this is really a new organisational forms question. It's a comparison of home or remote working with office working. I mean, certainly we've seen home working, remote working increase generally over the years. But now with the coronavirus pandemic, there's a lot more mobile and remote working. So it's normally safer for employees, if they can, to work from home. That way they avoid coronavirus, either from commuting or from working closely with fellow employees in a closed office. Discuss how information communications technologies facilitated this change. Well, it's fairly straightforward. There are a number of mobile, remote technologies, such as technologies for conferencing, Zoom, Teams, technologies for collaboration, Slack, and generally technologies like laptops, smartphones, broadband. These all facilitate remote working. Social media and digital platforms also, to some extent, facilitate remote working. They facilitate communication between people when the people are not physically together. So, discuss whether home working is likely to continue after the pandemic and the associated lockdowns have eased. Well, okay, home working's got certain advantages. Certainly during the pandemic, so it's safer usually working at home. But even regardless, after the pandemic and lockdowns are finished, remote working, home working offers the employee a certain amount of autonomy, so can sort of organise themselves more. Convenience, productivity, less office politics, less commuting, so time's not wasted sitting on a train or a bus for hours on end. And it offers the company perhaps savings in office costs, so we can have desk sharing or hot desking. On the downside, the problems with home working, a lot of it is tied up with the employee's work-life balance. So it's very easy for an employee to work too little or too much. If they haven't got a manager there to guide them, dangers of loneliness, alienation, perhaps lack of facilities in the home. Not everybody's got homes that are suitable for home working. Management control, from the manager's point of view, it's a lot easier to manage people you can see. And trying to sort of get teams working together. It's much easier for a team to work together if they're all in the same room. And especially if that team is supposed to be, in some senses, creative, bounce ideas off each other. It's a lot better to do that in person rather than try and do it over Zoom. So, office working has, quite a few attractions as well in terms of effectiveness. Furthermore, not everybody can work from home. So certainly things like personal service, hospitality, retail, transport, the option's not open to work from home. However, because the pandemic's been going on for so long, many employees have developed new habits, new routines based on remote working, and they may not be happy to return to their old routines. They may not want to go back to commuting and spending hours a day on a bus or a train. So what's likely to happen? Well, it's going to be sort of situation dependent, I think. We may have more, I suspect we will have more flexible working, so working partly in the office and partly at home. That provides opportunities of cutting office costs, perhaps cutting home rentals and commuting costs. But at the same time, that's quite difficult to organise, especially if you're worried about social capital, creativity and team spirit. So whereas employees may want to get out of the house a bit more and perhaps come into the office, that's likely to be only a couple of days a week. But probably some element of flexible working or hybrid working, a couple of days a week in the office, a couple of days a week at home, that for many employees would be ideal, although I say it does place an additional burden on management to actually organise it. And certainly, obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. Some organisations have already said to their staff, you have to come back into the office 5 days a week, whereas other organisations have already started to get rid of some of their offices, cutting their costs, and asking people, to work 2 days a week at home and only come in 3 days a week. So we don't know how this is going to actually pan out, but I think you have the material to actually discuss possible consequences. And yeah, okay.
This question is very precise in its focus. It asks to discuss how search costs are having an impact on the way in which a company is able to use dynamic pricing to generate value. So first and foremost, it is very important to understand what are search costs, and search costs are the costs that companies and buyers are facing to meet to find each other. Dynamic pricing are mechanisms by which companies are able to fix pricing that are optimizing their revenues based on the knowledge and understanding of how each individual customers is willing to engage in the exchange, which means, in a nutshell, how much each individual buyer is willing to pay for a specific good or service. And so by using dynamic prices, companies are able to adapt their prices so to extract as much value as possible from the market. Ideally, each individual customer will pay the maximum price that he or she is willing to pay for that specific good. So what is the relationship between search cost and dynamic pricing? Well, the more companies are able to intercept customers, which means the more are the customers that they are able to intercept, the better they are at learning how to fix prices, but also the better they will be at identifying those who are willing to pay the highest price, which means will be able to sell at the highest possible price. Let's take an example. We have 3 customers that are willing to buy a good, and each customer is willing to pay a maximum price of £3 for their specific good. If the company is able to reduce the search cost and find 100 customers, assuming that they have a limited amount of goods to be sold, like let's say 3 units, and out of the pool of 100 customers, they will identify 3 customers where one customer is willing to pay £6, one customer is willing to pay £5, and one customer is willing to pay £4, while the other 97 customers are willing to pay £3, well, the company will sell the goods at the 3 customers that are willing to pay the highest price. So in this case, the company will sell 3 items at an overall revenue of £15. And the company had higher search cost, which means being able to find less customers. It would have only found 3 customers willing to pay £3, and its revenue would have been £9. So this is an example of the relationship between search cost and dynamic pricing. So the lower the search cost will be, the more value the company will be generating using dynamic pricing. Also, by reaching out more customers, the company will become better at understanding, will have a better knowledge of what are the customer preferences, and so even if it will not be able to use a perfect price discrimination mechanism, which means to target the price to each individual customers, but will use a segmented pricing discrimination mechanism, which is related to dynamic pricing, which means we'll use dynamic pricing for to target different groups of customers, and not each individual customer will get the same price, but group of customers with similar specificities and characteristics will get the same price. Well, the more information they will get from the market, the better they will become at fixing prices that are generating more value for the company. The answer should focus on the relationship between the search cost and dynamic pricing, and explain how a reduction on the search cost is having a positive impact on the value which is generated by the dynamic pricing. And so what is happening is that by addressing this issue, the answer will also be able to explain how a reduction in the search cost for the customers, which means the customers will be able to find more more sellers. Well, this reduction will allow customers also to find potentially sellers that are selling at a lower price. So the analysis of the double side effects of the reduction of the search cost on the welfare of sellers and buyers is needed to fully address this specific question. This question asks to discuss the key concept of network economic theory, which are critical mass, network externalities, network effects, and lock-ins, and to explain the reason why a new entrant in the digital economy might struggle to build a critical mass which is generating enough value for the participant in the marketplace to engage with the business and to make the business successful in the long run. Now, the concept of critical mass explains that when a business is affected by network effects, which means by the network economics in general, users, consumers, buyers, participants in the platform will only find it valuable to engage in the business if a certain level of engagement already exists with the business. So, for example, in a double-sided platform like eBay, buyers will only get advantage in participating in the marketplace if there are enough sellers. So, if there is a critical mass of sellers that offers enough products to be bought. Now, what is happening is that the more companies are participating in the marketplace, the more it will become difficult to reach that level of adoption engagement, which makes it valuable for user, buyers, participant to switch from an existing business to the one of the new entrant. So, just to make an example and to simplify the argument here, if a new business is started in an industry where no one else is participating, the critical mass will be very low, which means that it will be enough to have a low number of participants to make it valuable for new participants to engage in the business. Instead, if a company now, for example, wants to compete with eBay, with Amazon, with Google, well, the level of critical mass that they have to develop is the one that is at least as big as the pool of users that are already using the other platforms. That is the reason why it is very difficult for a new entrant to reach that level of adoption of the platform, the business, the digital activity that is already reached by the other competitors. So, in a nutshell, to explain why it is difficult to build a critical mass, a good answer will have to rely on the concept of lock-ins and explain that a new entrant will struggle to get the users that are needed to make it valuable the business because the users are already engaged with another platform. So the critical argument that needs to be elaborated here to provide a comprehensive answer to the question is this relationship between critical mass, network effects, and lock-ins. This question asks to discuss how a brick-and-mortar grocery retailer can fight back the advancement of online business, but it's asking us to discuss this in the light of a very specific theory, which is the transaction cost theory. So, to properly address this question, it is extremely important to frame the argument in the light of the theory and not to provide general explanation of different mechanisms that a brick-and-mortar grocery retailer can use to fight back an online business. So the mechanism that can be used by the brick-and-mortar shop has to be discussed and justified in the light of the transaction cost theory. Now, the way in which the business technologies are restructuring the organization of the business activities, especially in an exchange process like the one of a shop, is by reducing, as you know from what is discussed in the course, by reducing the transaction cost in the exchange process. And we know very many different mechanisms by which information and communication technologies can reduce the search cost, the contracting cost, and the control cost. Now, how can we provide ideas and mechanisms to a traditional shop to fight back the advancement of online business in the light of transaction cost theory? Well, the question actually already offers the indication of the solution. A brick-and-mortar grocery retail can fight back the advancement of online business by shaping the business and making offers and structuring the interaction with the customers in a way which reduces the transaction cost more than the way by which the technology reduces them. So the way by which the companies can respond to the advancement of the digital economy is by using business solutions and business strategies that are generating more value for the customers than the one that are generated by the online business. So a brick and mortar grocery business has a very good knowledge of its customers. Its customers are often located in the proximity of the business and are customers that have a long-lasting relationship with the business. Well, by so doing, the owner of the shop can make sure, for example, that each valuable customer, the customers that they want to target, is always finding what he or she wants, and by so doing is reducing the search cost of the customers. Also, the brick and mortar grocery retailer can make and provide more and better information on the products that are offered, knowing what are the information that each individual customer wants to have to satisfy its demand. Also, the grocery retailers, having a perfect knowledge of the customers, can offer line of credits that an online retailer cannot do because does not have any specific knowledge of the customers that are interacting with the business. So whatever example, and here this question leaves freedom to the students to think about the different example, has to be structured so that whatever solution is suggested as a way for the business to respond to the advancements of the online business is justified or justifiable in the light of the transaction cost theory. What will be valued here is the way in which the theory is used to justify the proposed solutions that can be used by the business to respond to the advantages of the online activity.